The air was heavy with smoke and disbelief. On February 1st, 1943, over the skies of Tunisia, a U.S. Army Air Force B-17 Flying Fortress was supposed to fall from the sky. Every rule of aerodynamics said it should have broken apart the moment it was hit. And yet, it didn't. The aircraft, known as All-American, had taken off that morning as part of a formation of bombers headed for enemy positions near Bizerte. It was a routine mission, or at least it was supposed to be. The crew, 10 men in their early 20s, joked nervously over the intercom as the sun rose over North Africa. They had done this dozens of times. They trusted the fortress around them. 4 roaring engines, steel armor, and the hope that luck might last another day. From the ground, the B-17 looked unstoppable. But high above the Mediterranean, it was just another target. At 20,000 feet, German fighters appeared on the horizon. The calm in the cockpit shattered as the intercom filled with shouts. "Bandits, 11 o'clock!" Tracer rounds streaked through the cold air. The formation broke apart as enemy planes dove in from every direction. Machine guns rattled, shells clanged against metal, smoke filled the sky like black rain. Inside the All-American, the men fought back with everything they had. Waist gunners fired until their barrels glowed red. The pilot, Captain Kendrick R. Bragg, tried to keep the plane steady through the chaos. Each vibration felt like the aircraft's last breath. Then it happened. A German Messerschmitt Bf 109 made a desperate head-on attack, firing until the very last second before slamming directly into the B-17's tail section. The impact was catastrophic. Metal tore like paper. A thunderous explosion ripped through the fuselage. The bomber lurched violently. Half of its tail was gone. Inside, the men were thrown from their positions. Cables snapped, controls jammed, and oxygen masks were ripped away. Through the shattered radio compartment, daylight poured in where solid steel had once been. For a few terrifying seconds, the aircraft began to spin, a slow, inevitable death spiral. Over the intercom, someone screamed, "We've lost the tail! We're finished!" But Captain Bragg didn't let go of the controls. He gritted his teeth, fighting to level the wings. "Hold on!" he shouted, his voice shaking but unbroken. And somehow, the B-17 stopped falling. When the smoke cleared, the crew couldn't believe what they saw. The entire rear fuselage, everything from the radio room to the tail gunner's position, was barely attached. A massive gap separated the two halves of the aircraft. Only a few twisted metal beams and control cables still connected them. It looked as if one strong gust of wind could tear the bomber completely apart. The tail gunner was gone. The left elevator was gone. And yet the engine still roared, defiant, alive. One of the crew muttered, "We're flying on faith." They should have jumped. Any sane man would have bailed out. But Bragg refused. "We're going home," he said. He knew that if they abandoned the plane, the wreckage would crash into enemy territory, and the survivors could be captured or killed. So they stayed. The co-pilot, Lieutenant Godfrey Cabral, crawled back through the wreckage to check the damage. He froze when he saw daylight cutting straight through the middle of the aircraft. It's gone," he whispered through the headset. But Bragg didn't respond. His hands were locked on the yoke, his eyes fixed forward. The fortress limped onward, shaking violently. Each minute felt like eternity. Cold wind roared through the open wound of the fuselage, tearing at their uniforms, freezing their hands, making every breath burn. Loose wires whipped around like serpents. The intercom crackled and then died. They were flying blind, no radio, no formation, no contact with the others. Below them, the desert stretched endlessly, yellow, gray, and silent. Above them, the sky was merciless. The crew watched the structure bend with every turn, every vibration threatening to finish what the Messerschmitt had started. The engineer shouted, "We're breaking apart." Bragg answered, "Not today." It was no longer about orders or victory. It was about survival, about defying death itself. For the next hour, the All-American flew as if by sheer will. No one spoke, no one dared to move. The men just stared at the open sky behind them, where they could literally see the tail section trembling, barely clinging to life. Every mile brought them closer to home and closer to collapse. When they finally crossed the coastline, the fuel was almost gone, and so was their strength. But they could see the airfield in the distance, salvation through the fog. Bragg's voice came through, calm and quiet. "Boys, we're gonna make it." What happened next would leave engineers speechless and make aviation history forever. Before that morning, February 1st, 1943, was supposed to be just another mission for the crew of the B-17 All-American. They were part of the 414th Bomb Squadron, based in Biskra, Algeria, and their orders were simple: destroy German positions near Tunis. It was one of dozens of raids the squadron had flown, but war has a way of turning routine into nightmare. The crew woke before dawn. The desert air was cold, the kind that seeps into your bones even before the sun rises. The ground crews moved like ghosts around the bombers, loading ammunition, checking fuel, tightening bolts. The smell of oil, metal, and adrenaline filled the air. Captain Kendrick R. Bragg walked slowly across the tarmac, coffee cup in hand, scanning the horizon. He was only 25, but already looked older. His eyes carried the quiet weight of someone who had seen too many missions that didn't come back. Beside him, Lieutenant Godfrey Cabral, his co-pilot, climbed aboard with a grin. "Another milk run," he said. Bragg didn't smile. "Let's hope so." Inside the bomber, the rest of the crew took their positions. Sergeant Norman D. Rogers, the bombardier, crouched over the Norden bomb site, checking its alignment. Corporal Paul Ensley, the radio operator, adjusted the frequency knobs. Sergeant Ralph Burbridge, the waist gunner, loaded belts of 50 caliber rounds into the Browning machine guns. Every man knew his role. Every man trusted the one beside him. That's how you stayed alive in the sky. At 8:06 a.m., the order came through: formation takeoff, target, enemy airfield near Bizerte. Engines roared to life, shaking the ground. Dust and sand whipped around the spinning propellers as the All-American rumbled down the runway and lifted into the pale desert light. In formation, 20 bombers climbed together like a silver wall of thunder. From below, they looked invincible. From inside, they were just 10 hearts beating in rhythm with 4 engines. For the first hour, everything went smoothly. The desert passed quietly below, yellow dunes, winding rivers, and the occasional glint of an enemy convoy. Then the radio crackled: "Bandits, 12 o'clock high." It was the call no one ever wanted to hear. Bragg looked up. Tiny black specks appeared against the morning sun, German fighters diving fast. The sound of machine gun fire filled the sky before anyone could speak. The first wave came in screaming, bullets tearing through the air. The All-American shook as tracer fire rattled across her wings. Bragg shouted, "Titan formation!" Cabral pulled back the throttle, keeping close to the lead plane. The gunners opened fire. The roar was deafening, a storm of 50 caliber thunder. From the right waist window, Burbridge shouted, "I got one! He's smoking!" But the next instant, another fighter came from below and riddled the fuselage with holes. The radio went dead. A flare of light filled the cockpit. Still, the crew pressed on. Their target was ahead, the airfield near Tunis, black with enemy activity. Rogers in the nose compartment adjusted his sights. "Bomb doors open," he called. The steady voice of Bragg replied, "Bombs away." A line of explosions flashed across the ground below, followed by a rising cloud of smoke. The mission was technically a success, but survival was another matter. As they turned for home, the fighters came again. This time they were desperate. The German defense had to stop the bombers before they reached friendly skies. The All-American took hit after hit. Holes opened in her wings. The tail section shuddered with every blast. Then came the attack that would make history. A Messerschmitt Bf-109, its pilot equally desperate, dove straight at them. The gunners opened fire, but it was too late. The German plane rammed directly into the B-17's tail before exploding in a ball of fire. The shock was beyond anything the crew had ever felt. The entire rear of the bomber seemed to vanish in a single instant. Cables snapped, metal screamed. A hurricane of air ripped through the cabin. Cabral shouted, "We've lost the tail! We're going down!" But Bragg refused to let go. His knuckles turned white on the control yoke. "Hold on!" he growled, fighting the impossible. "We're not done yet!" The formation scattered. Other crews could only watch in disbelief as the All-American began to fall, then, miraculously, stopped. One bomber pilot later radioed, "She's still flying, but she's cut in half." Inside, chaos gave way to silence. The men could see daylight through the gaping wound behind them. Only a handful of metal ribs held the tail section in place. The open air roared like a storm through the hole, pulling at their clothes, their faces, their hope. Cabral looked back and muttered, "We're flying a miracle." They didn't know it yet, but they would spend the next 90 minutes inside that miracle, defying every law of physics, every prediction of failure, every calculation of death. And when they landed, the engineers would have no words, only disbelief. The All-American should have fallen apart. By every law of physics, by every equation any engineer could write, that aircraft should have disintegrated the moment the tail was torn away. But it didn't. What followed was 90 minutes that no one would ever forget. The collision had turned the inside of the plane into chaos. Cables hung loose like vines. The cold wind roared through the gaping wound, dragging bits of insulation and paper into the sky. The smell of burnt oil, metal, and fear filled the cabin. Bragg's voice broke through the headset. "Check your stations. Check your men." No one answered for a long second. The intercom sputtered with static. Then the engineer's voice came through, shaking. "Tail gunner's gone, sir. No response." Silence. They all knew what that meant. Cabral looked back through the broken fuselage. He could see straight through to the tail, flapping violently, connected only by twisted strips of aluminum and a handful of control cables. Every jolt of turbulence made it sway like it was hanging by a thread. The bomber looked more like two separate machines, barely holding hands. Bragg's hands were locked on the control column. His jaw was clenched so tightly it hurt. The yoke trembled as if alive, trying to pull free from his grip. Every vibration sent shudders through the cabin. The engines were still running, all four, but the structure couldn't take much more. The co-pilot yelled, "We can't hold it together! We need to bail!" Bragg didn't move. "We jump," he said quietly, "and this ship goes down in enemy territory. We stay. Maybe we make it." It wasn't a question. It was an order. The crew understood. They didn't agree, but they understood. So they stayed. The next minutes were pure endurance. The crew worked by instinct, plugging holes, tying down loose wires, redistributing weight to keep the nose level. The bombardier moved toward the back, grabbing a spool of parachute cord and securing what remained of the tail section. The rope stretched across the open wound, flapping violently in the wind, but it held, at least for now. Cabral leaned toward the pilot. "She's still responding," he said, disbelief in his voice. Bragg gave a tight nod. "Then we keep flying." Outside, the desert sun was beginning to fade into haze. Below them stretched endless sand and rock. No roads, no signs of life. The crew took turns peering through the holes in the fuselage, each one silently praying. The bomber's shadow wavered on the ground, broken into two distinct shapes, one for the front, one for the tail, as if the aircraft itself couldn't decide whether it was whole or not. The controls were sluggish. Every movement of the yoke required both Bragg and Cabral to wrestle it together. The stabilizers in the rear no longer responded properly. The airflow tore at the remnants of the tail, threatening to rip it off completely. Still, they moved forward. 10 miles, then 20, then 30. Other bombers in the formation circled, watching in disbelief. One pilot later said over the radio, "It's impossible. She's cut clean through and still flying." Inside, the All-American was alive only because of teamwork. The crew communicated through hand signals and shouts. Without the intercom, they passed messages down the line like soldiers in a trench. One by one, each man did his part. The gunner holding cables steady, the navigator calculating the shortest route home, the radio operator trying in vain to repair the antenna torn away by the blast. At one point, a gust of turbulence struck from below. The aircraft lurched so violently that the men thought it was over. The rear fuselage twisted, the connecting beams bent with a metallic groan, and for a moment, the tail hung by only a few inches of metal. But it didn't break. Somehow, impossibly, it didn't break. Bragg glanced at Cabral. Neither spoke, but they both knew. If they turned too sharply, climbed too fast, or descended too hard, the aircraft would snap in half. It was a fragile miracle, a balance between flight and collapse. Minute by minute, they limped across the sky. The engine temperatures were stable, fuel consumption normal, but the structure was near failure. Each vibration could be the last. Yet the horizon ahead was changing. Patches of green appeared among the sand. They were nearing the Allied coast. At 30,000 feet, with the coastline barely visible, Bragg risked a radio call. Static hissed, then a faint voice answered, "All-American, is that you? We thought you were gone." Bragg exhaled slowly. Not yet. The crew cheered weakly, a mix of relief and disbelief. But they weren't safe. Not yet. Landing would be the hardest part. Any sudden movement could tear the aircraft apart before the wheels touched the ground. Bragg spoke to his men. "When we hit the runway, stay low. Don't move. If she breaks apart, crawl clear." No one argued, they just nodded. The base at Biskra prepared emergency crews. Fire trucks lined the runway. Mechanics and medics waited, staring at the horizon for the ghostly silhouette that shouldn't exist. When they finally saw it, the broken bomber wobbling through the mist, no one spoke. Some men simply removed their hats. The All-American descended slowly, painfully, the wounded tail shuddering with each gust of wind. Bragg kept his eyes locked on the horizon. His hands didn't shake. He had flown through hell. Now he just had to land there. Every minute that passed inside the All-American felt like a small lifetime. The bomber had lost nearly a third of its structure, and yet it still clung to the sky, a wounded beast refusing to die. The crew didn't speak much anymore. Words were useless against the wind screaming through the torn fuselage. Every man simply did what had to be done. Captain Kendrick Bragg kept both hands locked on the control yoke. His gloves were torn, his knuckles white, the muscles in his arms burning from constant resistance. The control cables that ran to the tail were frayed and exposed, jerking violently with each vibration. Somehow, through instinct more than physics, the plane still responded. Bragg muttered to himself, "Easy, girl, hold together, just a little longer." The co-pilot, Lieutenant Cabral, leaned over the instruments. Half of them were useless. The needles jumped and spun, the glass cracked. But one thing mattered, the compass. As long as they could keep heading south toward the Allied base, they had a chance. In the waist compartment, Sergeant Burbridge crawled toward the open wound where the bomber had been sliced in two. The cold hit him like a wall. The tail section ahead of him was moving up and down like the wing of a bird. He could see daylight beneath his boots. One more strong gust, and it would all be over. He reached for a length of parachute cable, looping it around a jagged metal spar. If this holds, he thought, it'll be a miracle. He wasn't wrong. The engineer joined him, tying down anything that looked like it might fly away. Toolboxes, ammunition belts, even a first aid kit that kept sliding toward the hole. They had no idea if their efforts helped, but it gave them something to do, something to believe in. Back in the cockpit, Cabral risked a glance at Bragg. "Fuel's good. Engines are fine. We shouldn't be alive right now." Bragg didn't look up. "Then stop reminding me." Minutes turned into hours, or at least that's how it felt. The All-American droned on, the engines coughing occasionally but never quitting. Below them, the barren desert began to give way to the faint shimmer of the Mediterranean Sea. Home was somewhere beyond that horizon, but the wind was getting worse. Gusts rolled through the torn fuselage, making the tail twist dangerously. The bomber dropped 50 feet, then climbed again. The men braced for the sound of metal tearing, but somehow it never came. Through the cold air, Sergeant Rogers, the bombardier, crawled forward to the cockpit. His goggles were frosted over, his face was pale. "The tail's separating, sir," he shouted. "It's not going to hold much longer." Bragg's response was calm, almost gentle. "Then let's make it before it gives up." The others stayed silent, each man trapped in his own thoughts. Some prayed under their breath. Others stared out at the sky, too numb to think. They'd been flying for over an hour since the impact, far longer than anyone believed possible. At the base in Biskra, crews scanned the northern horizon. Radio operators listened to static, waiting for a signal that would never come. No one expected to see the All-American again. Mechanics had already prepared to mark her as missing, presumed lost. Then, one lookout shouted, "Aircraft incoming!" At first, they thought it was a trick of the light, a ghost against the haze. But as it drew closer, the impossible became clear. The All-American was returning. Through binoculars, they saw the gaping wound down her side, daylight shining straight through. The tail hung on like a flag in a storm. "She's in two pieces," one officer whispered, "and she's still flying." Back in the cockpit, Bragg and Cabral could see the airfield, a thin strip of earth that meant everything. The tower came on the radio. "All-American, you're clear for emergency landing. Fire crews are ready." Cabral answered, his voice steady for the first time in hours. "Roger that. Let's bring her home." Bragg began the descent carefully. Too steep, and the tail would snap. Too shallow, and they'd run out of runway. He moved the controls with the delicacy of a surgeon. Every movement was slow, precise, and painful. The crew held their breath as the ground rose toward them. At 100 feet, the bomber began to shake violently. The right wing dipped, the tail sagged. The cables groaned like dying metal. Bragg corrected, just enough to level out. The engine screamed. Then, contact! The wheels hit the dirt with a jolt. Dust exploded behind them. The bomber bounced once, twice, and slid to a stop. The men sat frozen, waiting for the aircraft to collapse. But it didn't. The All-American rested quietly, broken but intact. When the engines finally powered down, silence filled the cockpit. Cabral exhaled. We're home." Bragg didn't answer right away. He just looked out over the shattered nose of the plane and whispered, "She got us back." Ground crews rushed toward the wreck, expecting to find bodies. Instead, they found 10 men alive, pale, exhausted, but grinning through disbelief. The bomber's rear section was hanging by a thread, the tail still trembling in the desert wind. An engineer examined the damage and shook his head. "This shouldn't exist," he said quietly. "That plane shouldn't have flown another second, but it had, for 90 minutes. And the photograph they took that day would go on to astonish the world. Proof that courage, discipline, and sheer will can sometimes make the impossible fly." When the All-American finally came to rest on the runway at Biskra, time itself seemed to freeze. The airfield crews, medics, and engineers who rushed to the scene expected wreckage, a charred shell or fragments of metal. Instead, they found the bomber intact, silent, and almost impossibly alive. Its tail was split open, dangling by a few twisted struts, the fuselage torn nearly in half. Yet the engines were still ticking softly, as if the aircraft itself was breathing after surviving the impossible. The men who stepped out of that plane looked like ghosts. Their uniforms were shredded, faces grey with exhaustion, eyes red from wind and smoke. None of them spoke at first. They simply touched the ground, as if confirming that it was real, that they had truly returned home. Mechanics and officers crowded around, staring in disbelief. One of them whispered, "How did this thing not fall apart?" Another muttered, "It's a miracle." An engineer climbed into the wreckage, flashlight in hand. What he saw made no sense. The main fuselage had been severed just behind the waist gunner's position, leaving barely a few inches of metal connecting front and rear. The tail section hung by control cables and sheer luck. The control rods were snapped, the skin peeled back like torn paper, and yet somehow the structure had held just long enough. Photographers were called in immediately. The images they captured that day, the All-American sitting on the runway, daylight shining through her torn body, would become some of the most iconic photographs of World War II. They didn't just show a damaged plane, they showed defiance itself. Captain Kendrick Bragg refused to leave the aircraft until the last of his crew was safe. He stood by the cockpit window, watching as medics checked on the men. All 10 had survived, every single one. When a reporter later asked him how he managed to land, Bragg's answer was simple. "She brought us home. I just held on." The engineers spent hours studying the bomber, crawling under the torn metal, tracing each fracture. One of them, a structural specialist from the 97th Bomb Group, said later, "That plane shouldn't have lasted 60 seconds in the air. 90 minutes. That's beyond explanation." The All-American was officially declared unrepairable, but the command refused to scrap her right away. For weeks, officers brought new crews to look at the aircraft, a lesson in courage and design. The men would stand in silence before the wound that nearly destroyed her, then walk away different. Stories spread across Allied bases. Pilots who had flown hundreds of missions said they had never seen anything like it. Newspapers picked up the photos. Headlines called it "The Bomber That Wouldn't Die" and "The Miracle Fortress." It became a symbol, proof that the Flying Fortress had earned its name. But for the men who had lived it, it wasn't just about machinery. Lieutenant Cabral, the co-pilot, wrote in a letter home, "I saw the tail moving like it was alive, as if it wanted to stay with us. I think that plane had a soul." For the rest of their lives, the crew carried that memory. They went on to fly new missions, some even in new bombers, but none ever forgot that February day when they saw the impossible happen. Whenever they met again, they'd joke quietly about how the All-American refused to quit. But underneath the laughter was reverence. They all knew they'd been part of something no one could fully explain. In 1944, the All-American was finally dismantled for parts. Her wings were used to repair other B-17s, her engines salvaged, her frame recycled into the war effort. But the memory of that broken fuselage, the hole you could see straight through, remained etched in history. Even decades later, historians and engineers studied the photos, trying to understand how a plane that structurally destroyed could have stayed airborne. Some said it was the strong internal bulkhead design. Others credited aerodynamic luck. Most agreed it was something beyond calculation, the perfect balance between human will and mechanical grace. When Captain Bragg retired years later, he kept one small piece of the All-American on his desk, a twisted fragment of aluminum. Visitors would ask about it, and he'd smile faintly. "That piece," he'd say, "should have been at the bottom of the desert, but she decided to come home." And that was the truth of it. A story not of machines, but of men. Of a crew that refused to surrender, of courage stronger than fear, and of an aircraft that somehow shared that courage. Today, the photographs still circulate, black and white reminders of that miracle in the sky. Historians still call it one of the most extraordinary survivals in aviation history. And somewhere, deep in the memory of those who flew her, the all-American still flies, a fortress held together by faith, steel, and the unbreakable spirit of 10 men who believed that impossible didn't mean the end.